All right, so I've got 116. I'm going to go ahead and start this session. So thank you all again for those of you who stuck around. Again, my name is Carrie Hicks and I'm chair of the GIS committee within the All Hazards Consortium. And to kick things off today in this session, I'm going to turn it over to Dave Vanderbloemen, who's going to be saying a few words to kick us off. So Dave, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Carrie. Hello to everybody. As Carrie said, I'm just going to provide you a brief outline and state some objectives of today's exercise. And if you've been listening to the previous presentations and the tracks yesterday, you probably realize, and probably didn't need us to tell you, but in today's environment, the availability of data is abundant. It can be found in many sources, delivered in a variety of formats, and can be easily obtained by end users. Problem with this is without some sort of scrutiny, it's pretty difficult to determine the validity or the accuracy of the data set that you're obtaining. This unknown puts decision makers at risk. Decisions made using inaccurate data can be costly. A lack of trust in the data can delay decision making, which is dangerous as well. Which leads us to the operational readiness level, the ORL model. This model was developed to help assist in determining the quality of the data that we're using. It evaluates the technical attributes of the data set using a consistent criteria. The result is an excellent translation tool that produces a standardized ranking of the data set with the numerical value, 1 being the highest level of operational reliability, down to 4, which is the lowest level. So it allows you to translate the data from a technical standpoint to an operational standpoint. So it allows your GIS technicians and your operational people to start talking better to one another. The power of the ORL model provides visibility of data sets reliabilities, as well as its deficiencies, which ultimately allows in operational resources to make better and quicker data-driven decisions. The session that Carrie will lead us through today will show you in detail how to perform that ORL evaluation. And what I hope we get out of this is 3 objectives. 1, for the technical people here, ensure you understand the questions and rank each data set consistently. Consistency is vital. For the operational people, like myself, provide insight into the ranking process so you understand the ranking levels, giving you confidence in the data set you choose to assist in making your decisions. But more importantly, it's going to remove, hopefully, any internal organizational barriers between the operational and the technical resources by fostering discussions and commitment to teamwork to achieve your common goals. I believe your success will be achieved when your teams have open dialogue, ask questions, and work together to retrieve, evaluate, and implement trusted data sets into your decision-making process. That requires both technical and operational resources working together. And I believe this ORL model is an excellent tool to facilitate that discussion. What it'll do, it'll help you as an operator reduce the risk, mitigate the risk that you have when you make a decision. So you can make your decisions in confidence, and your GIS technicians can stand beside you as you make those decisions. In closing, I hope you find this session to be informative, and I hope that you leverage these lessons that you learned today and you implement them in your own organizations. So Carrie, I'll turn it back over to you to lead us through the exercise.
Those were great opening comments. Thank you so much, Dave. Okay, so if anybody has not gone ahead and joined our Slido, again, you can navigate to this link right here that Tom also.
Carrie, I put the wrong link in there. I corrected it again, but it checked the chat. It's in the chat. I put the wrong one in the first time. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. So just navigate to the most recent link to Slido that Tom put in the chat, and the event code is 23090. Or if you would rather scan this QR code with the camera app on your phone, it will just go ahead and prompt a link to open right on your phone, which I think is even easier. So I'll just give everybody another couple seconds to go ahead and join our Slido. And I just desperately need this toolbar to go away. How can I make this go away? It's just right in my way. Okay, fine, we'll do this.
That's funny.
All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and activate our poll. So I'd like everybody who's joined our Slido to let me know how you all are feeling today. How are you feeling? Great. Oh, we've got some positive answers. Wow. Okay, we have a fine. I feel like that one's pretty honest. Excited for this session. Awesome. If you're hungry, just go get a snack. We're pretty casual here. You can snack during the session. It's fine. Awesome. So I see some really, really positive responses, which makes me very happy. I'm also feeling great and excited for this session. So this is kind of a way to get everybody go in the Slido, because we're going to be using that later on during this workshop. So thanks to everyone for popping in there. So before we jump into the workshop part, I just want to give an overview of the problem statement that we were attempting to address with the ORL model. So when a GIS professional takes data from an external source and shows that data to a non-GIS professional, there's critical information about that data that gets lost in translation. Mainly, the non-GIS professional wants to know how reliable the data set is without wanting to wade through a list of technical characteristics. They just don't have time for that. Can I make a decision using this? That non-GIS professional might ask. The GIS professional is perhaps confused. What are the criteria one could use to even answer such a question? When someone says, can I make a decision using this data? How do you answer that question? As a GIS professional, that's a difficult one to answer. So the GIS professional might explain certain aspects of the technical details of the data set, things like spatial resolution, update frequency, data source, etc. But the non-GIS professional then shares that data set with their colleagues, and this always happens. Those details get lost along the way. It's like a game of telephone. The 10th person to get the link to that data set won't have a clue how reliable the data set really is. All of those technical characteristics that GIS professional relayed to the non-GIS professional, there's no way those are going to travel with the data set. This sort of problem is common in all industries that use GIS, but especially in ones where rapid data-driven decision-making may be necessary, such as in a storm response event. So industries like electric, food, telecom, industries like that, where we might be in a situation where we're responding to major events or major disruptive events. These problems are exacerbated because timeliness is so key. We're always in a rush during those kinds of events. The implications for losing this data-specific information could have impacts on safety and efficiency. So the ORL model was designed to avoid this situation. The ORL model is a tool that allows us to translate, as Dave mentioned, the operational readiness of a data set from the technical data characteristics, those things that we really just don't want our decision makers being bogged down with, to an easy to understand and standardized ranking. Data sets are ranked between a 1, or the highest level of operational reliability, to 4, which is the lowest level of operational reliability. The GIS analyst or the GIS professional can quickly rank the data set using preset criteria. And these criteria, I should mention, our committee worked for a long time to come up with what those criteria should be. So it's a very collaborative effort. And a lot of those criteria came from people that are in operations. They weren't GIS professionals. So these are things that decision makers want and need to know about data. When they pass that data along to a decision maker, that person immediately understands the reliability of the data set without having to sort through technical details. And as that data set gets passed along to other decision makers, the ranking travels with it. So rather than our situation before where all that information about the data just gets lost each time a new person looks at it, now the ranking travels with it. And every person looking at that data immediately understands how reliable it is. The power of the model is in the immediate recognition of data set reliability and of its shortcomings. This allows for decision makers to make better data-driven decisions, and ultimately for data providers to provide better data, which we'll see how that happens a little bit later. So those of you who joined our ORL session yesterday will recognize this graphic, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I just want to do a quick review. This is the ORL model decision tree. And what this represents is the logic behind the model and all of the criteria involved in coming to a ranking. So we look at things like whether or not the data set comes from a trusted and vetted source, the security aspect, is it SSL encrypted? Is it interoperable? Is it in a format that's easily shareable and consumed in a GIS environment? What's the restoration time for that service if it were to go down? What's the change notification? You know, do users get notified if something changes about that data set or the service? And has the data been verified and tested? And then finally, what components are in the metadata? Is it missing certain components that we really need to know? So as you can see, basically you start at the top left and you answer these questions, and it's a simple yes or no. And if you answer yes, you keep going down. You're within the ORL 1. If you answer no, depending on which question it is, you're going to get bumped down to a lower ORL level. And I just want to say, most of the data sets that we rank right now are not ORL 1. There's certain criteria that we really need from an operational standpoint that we find consistently lacking in these data sets. And that doesn't mean that the data is bad. This is what I meant, that hopefully data providers will help us by providing better data. I think they just need to know the information that we need. So, you know, an example of that would be change notification. A lot of data sets, there's no real method for alerting users if the data has changed or if the symbology has changed. And maybe if we can encourage data providers to improve that, their data sets will go up in ranking, because these are not permanent set in stone rankings. They can improve over time if aspects of the data are improved. So I want to present a scenario, one that I think many of us can relate to, and that is a flooding event. So pretend with me that you are a GIS professional and you're helping to respond to a major flooding event. You have a web mapping application that you help manage. So this application contains data that helps with situational awareness, maybe some routing information. It's got NOAA watches and warnings, everything that a decision maker might need to assess what's going on outside to make decisions. Someone from logistics requests that you add data to help them determine which areas might be flooded and which areas might flood in the next 24 hours. So an important key thing here is that we're not just looking for current flooding, we're also looking for, if possible, potential flooding, which those of you who are familiar with flooding events is very difficult to come across. That data is not easy to find. So looking at our application, this is just an example, right? It's very basic, but it might look something like this. So you have a couple of layers in here already. We have 3 different layers of information. We have a QPF, which is called the Quantitative Precipitation Forecast. This one is 24 hours out. I have that one defaulted off, but we can turn it on to see what it looks like. Now I'm just going to pop this out. There we go. Move my face around. Okay, so like I said, we have our QPF, which is right here. We also have some radar. And as you can see, these already have ORL levels. These have already been ranked. So our base reflectivity from NOAA, we have that turned on. We also have our watches and warnings, which again, if you were in our session yesterday, you would have seen me playing around with this layer. Super useful. It's one of my very favorite data layers that we use. This one just shows the current active watches and warnings and advisories from NOAA. So this is our web app that us as a GIS professional, we help manage. Going back to our scenario. So we need to find data that is going to give us not only observed flooding, but also forecasted flooding. So let's pretend for a moment that we do some digging, and in our digging, we find a service from NOAA that shows live stream gauge data. So let's take a look at this data. What you might notice about this data set is that there's 3 different symbology levels, right? Along with the colors. So what these symbology levels mean is that some of these gauges only show observations. Some of them show forecasts. So if we zoom in here, we'll zoom into my favorite part of the country, which is where I live, and that's Cincinnati. So we've got a stream gauge here, and if you hover over it, it's actually going to show you the current flood levels and the current stream levels. And that's in flow. So this looks like a good data set. This looks like about what we need. If a decision maker goes in here and they know there's a river, which there is running through here, and they're concerned about whether or not it's going to flood, they can look at this and they can assess, okay, well, here's the forecasted river stages. And this can help them determine whether or not that area is going to flood. So we're going to say that this is a good data set that we want our decision makers to look at. So we're at this graphical web page, and we need to actually find a way to get that data out of this web page and into our web app. So there really isn't a super elegant way to do this. And if you look on this web page, and I scoured this page, there isn't a link that I could find that links directly to the REST service or a place to download the data. There is on other parts of the website, but on this page, I didn't find anything. So those of you who are GIS professionals will recognize this. But what I do is I just say, okay, NOAA, stream, gauges, ArcGIS REST. And a lot of times if you type that into Google, let's say you want to find Walmart locations, ArcGIS REST, you'll probably find a REST service that shows the data you're looking for. Doesn't mean you should use it though, as we will see. So here's a good link. Let's open that. This is it. So you can see it actually links to that exact same graphical web page we were just at. It also links to where you can download the data, which is good. If you want to actually download it, in our case, we're not going to download it. We're just going to use the REST service endpoint. So then how do we get this data into our web app? I'm going to return to our story map here. So before we actually add the data to our web app, we want to follow what we've outlined as kind of our ORL best practices. So this is a step-by-step process you can follow. And the first step, sorry about that. The first step is to actually rank the data set. So that's what we're going to do next. And let's see, I would very much like to put this link in the chat, but I don't know if I can. Tom, are you able to put this link in the chat? If not, I've created a short URL. So if you navigate to this short URL, you can open this form. So Tom, I don't know if you can type that into the chat. That might make it easier. But just navigate to this short URL, and we're going to actually go through this web form together. I wonder if I stop screen sharing, if I can. Yep. All right. Thank you, Dave. I will go back to screen sharing. Okay, so if you open this web form, this was built using Survey 123 by ArcGIS, which is a super useful tool. And this is actually going to let us rank the data set and get an ORL level. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and explain each step in this process. And then I want us all on our own to rank this data set. All right, so the other thing that we're going to need in the chat here is the link to the REST service. So let me send that as well. Okay. I almost clicked leave. I don't want to leave. Okay. All right. So at the start of this page, there's a description of the model, which we've talked about quite a bit. It talks about what the different levels mean. The first thing is that I want you to put in the data source URL. So the first couple of questions here, this is really for use of the sites. We want to get a better understanding of the kinds of data sets people are ranking, what the intended use is. This just helps us better understand how this model is being used, which is very important. So this is open to anyone. If you want to rank a data set, you can. If you do, we just ask that you put the link to the data set. If it's online, it may not be, but if it is, just put the URL in here. And it's asking for our intended use. So in this case, we're going to say testing, but if this were a real world scenario, you would probably choose operational decision making. Now it's asking for specifics. So our two options are ORL ranking tool testing or testing reliability of a data set. I'm going to go ahead and say ORL ranking tool testing. But just to show you, if you chose operational decision making, it's going to ask you for planning, disaster response, recovery, or other. So in this case, disaster response would probably be the correct answer. All right. So now it's asking for some data source keywords. Here we can put flooding, weather, and that's probably good. It's going to autofill the date. Okay, so going through these different questions. The first one is whether or not this is a trusted and vetted source. So I'm not going to tell you how to answer, but I will say that the data source is NOAA. So if you actually click on the link to the SICE list, it's going to give a list of trusted and vetted data sources. And I can tell you that NOAA is definitely on there. So this first question is pretty straightforward. The next question is about security. It's asking whether or not the data set is SSL encrypted. And for each of these questions, I just want to point out, you can expand this little arrow and it's going to give you a description. So for this one, it tells you how to answer yes and how to answer no. So for this one, it says read the URL. If it's encrypted, then the answer is yes. So, and if it's HTTP, the answer is no. The next question is about data format shareability. We can expand this and take a look at the different criteria. So you answer yes if it's an ArcGIS REST service, or if it's a shapefile, geodatabase, or KMZ. You answer no if it's an Excel file, CSV, or text file. Next question is about service availability. This one has to do with how much the service goes down, what the downtime is. This could be maintenance or interruptions during major events. So what we're looking for here is some kind of information, whether on this page or on the graphical web page that we saw earlier, this page. Does it tell us somewhere how much downtime this service has? The next question is about change notification. This gives you a bit of a description. Is there some kind of process in place to alert users of changes? And I just want to mention that a lot of these questions are a little subjective, so don't feel like there's a right or wrong answer. There's a good chance that we might all come up with different answers to these questions, and that's okay. Now the question of whether or not the data set has been verified and tested. Given that it's NOAA and that it's, on a graphical web page, it's kind of in a production environment, we're going to assume that yes, this data has been verified and tested. Normally you would answer no if the data provider says that the data is in development or it's in beta or something like that, or they can't verify the quality. Some other buzzwords might be that there's no support provided, things like that. Then we want to look at metadata completeness. So the criteria that you're looking for with the metadata is this information. Does it tell you how often the data is updated? Does it provide you with spatial resolution if applicable? In this case, it's point data. It's not as applicable. Is there guidance for interpretation? And when we're talking about metadata, we're talking about this page. This is the page that we're looking at to determine if that information is there, okay? Does it tell you the data source or the data provider, and is there contact information? All right, so just to go over what we're doing, everybody should have a link to this page, and everybody should have a link to this form. And just to make sure, you may need a link to this as well. So let me just post this in the chat. Oh, I've been posting just to panelists. There we go. Okay. So what I'd like for everybody to do is take a few minutes and go through this form and answer these questions as best you can. Again, there's no right or wrong answer. Just do your best. And there are options for I don't know if you look through the metadata and you see you don't find the answer to your question. So don't be afraid to put I don't know. And we're just going to see what we get. So I am going to unshare my screen and I'm going to go through this too. And you guys can just stare at my face awkwardly for a minute while we go through the form.
Carrie, we got a small group. Maybe we can, for those that want, maybe we can promote them to panelists and they can share their screen, I guess, I think, or something like that.
Certainly.
Let's try one before I screw this up. Let's try. Somebody want to talk with us?
Okay, we'll give this another 30 seconds or so.
Hey, Carrie.
Mm-hmm.
The shortcut URL from Dave didn't work for me either. Do we have the link?
Yes.
I think, hang on a second. Can you put it in the chat?
Yep.
Perfect. Oh yeah, that looks like an Esri survey 1, 2, 3 link. Thanks, Dave. Nice try.
Yeah, so everybody go ahead and open that link. Sorry about that. Okay, so I think maybe at this point it's best if we go through it together, Tom.
Sure, you want to just share your screen?
Yeah. All right.
Yeah, you may want to zoom in and enlarge your screen as much as you can. It's hard to.
How's that? Is that better, Tom?
I'm sorry. Yes, much better.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to share how I answered these questions and how I came to those answers. So the answer to the first question of whether or not it comes from a trusted and vetted source is definitely yes. This is a NOAA service. So we know that this is a trusted and vetted source. So far we're at ORL 1, okay? The next question is about security. So the easiest way to see if a service has HTTPS, gosh, this toolbar. So just going back to our REST service endpoint, if there's a little lock symbol up here, that means that it's HTTPS. So super easy, just look at the URL. It's not showing you HTTPS in the actual full URL, but it's there, it's that lock symbol. So the answer to that question is yes. We're still at an ORL 1, so far so good. Data format shareability. So if we expand this, one of the options is an ArcGIS REST service, which this is. So we're for sure going to answer yes to that question. So answer is yes. So the next one, this is when we start to see a change in our ranking. So service availability. And if we look at the description, to answer yes, the service must be available at least 95% of the time. So there's a couple ways you can come about ascertaining this information. One is to do your own monitoring. I've used services like AlertSite before. These allow you to intermittently ping a service, and over time it will give you an estimate of how much downtime it has. If you don't have that, another source of information would be the metadata, or in this case, the graphical web page, or if you ask the data provider and they tell you, right? Well, if we go to the metadata, there's no information in there about it. You can look through pretty thoroughly, and there's no information that says this, this service is, has X downtime. And sometimes you will see that. So sometimes it will say, we take the service down over the weekend for maintenance or something. It's very possible the service is up all the time 24/7 and supported 24/7. It just doesn't say so. So for that question, we are going to answer no, or I don't know, actually would be. So I said, I don't know. For change notification, this one again is a little bit subjective. So I said yes because of this graphical web page. You can tell that if something were to change with this data set, most likely it would be put in this graphical web page. You can tell that this web page is updated and maintained. So again, it's a little bit subjective, but I said yes to this question. But again, if you expand that, it gives you some more information about, how to arrive at a yes or no answer. Verified and tested, yes, we can tell there's no statement here or in the metadata saying that this is in development or in a testing phase, or that there's no support offered for this data. So we're going to say yes, this is verified and tested. So metadata completeness, this one's a little bit tricky. There's one aspect of the metadata that for me is missing, and that is going to be the latency. So again, I can see how someone might answer yes, because it does tell you what the forecast periods are. What it doesn't tell you is how often the data gets updated, right? You can kind of guess. If you watch the last map update, you can kind of come at a guess of how often it gets updated, but it doesn't come right out and say, this data is refreshed every 15 minutes, or the data is actually collected in the field every 15 minutes, or something like that. It's just, I've looked through it a couple times and I didn't see it, right? So that's the kind of data that we are really looking for, the kind of information that we want to find with this data. Overall, this is a really great REST service endpoint. It's got a lot of information. It just doesn't have the answer to a couple of key questions, right? Does the data go down for maintenance? Is there support, and how often is it collected? The other things are there. So spatial resolution, again, these are points, so that's not as relevant, but there's definitely guidance for interpretation, right? This page gives you pretty good information on how to read, these gauges, and the graphical web page does too. It shows you what the different colors mean, what the actual symbols mean. So the guidance for interpretation is definitely there. The source and providers there, and there is even contact information. So you can click on this link to email the IDP GIS team, which I have emailed this team before and they have responded. So someone is monitoring this email address. So we could ask them, hey, what's the details on, service downtime, and how often is this data collected? And can you add that to your metadata? So the resulting ORL ranking that I got is 4, which is surprising. So this is where, I'm going to refer back to what we said earlier, which is that we want to see better data and better metadata coming out of this from data providers, right? This is a great data set, and ORL 4 does not mean that it shouldn't be used. It just means to have a questioning attitude when using it, because there's certain key aspects of the metadata missing. So I'm not sure if anybody was able to actually go through the rankings on their own since the link wasn't working. And I don't know how to find out that answer since, let's see if, info from the NOAA site. Okay, so the metadata that I was getting was either from the REST service endpoint or from the actual graphical web page, which there is a link in the chat that links to the graphical web page for the data. Okay, so I'm going to keep motoring. Yeah. So now that we have a ranking for our data set, we want to actually add it to our web app. So just for a reminder, this is our web app. So I'm going to go through that process right now, and I'm going to actually scroll up and refer to our diagram here. So our next step is to create a group in your portal or ArcGIS Online organization. And this is an optional step, but I find it useful. It helps to kind of segregate all of our ORL ranked data sets into one group, right? So going to my ArcGIS Online organization, I'm going to go to groups, and I actually already have a group created, but I'm going to show it to you. This is my group, and it's called ORL ranked data. It says repository for external data sets, and I have a data set in here. It's the ORL1 watches and warnings data set from NOAA that I showed earlier. But if you didn't already have a group, this is where you can create your own group. You can call it ORL ranked data, external data sets, something along those lines. But it's just good practice to keep those in one place. Okay, so our next step is to add our data set to our portal or ArcGIS Online organization. And we have a naming convention that we came up with. Basically, it's the ORL ranking hyphen what the data is, and then colon the source of the data. So to do this, we're going to go back to our REST service endpoint, and we're going to grab this URL, and we're going to just copy that. And we're going to go back to our ArcGIS Online organization. This process is the same for portal. And we're going to select add item from a URL. Now, I just want to say really quickly, so if you have a web app in ArcGIS Online or in portal, you don't have to go through this step of adding the item to your portal, right? You can just add it directly to the web map. I don't recommend doing that though. From a best practices perspective, you definitely want to add your external data sets to your portal or your ArcGIS Online organization, because then it allows you to tag them with the use case and the ORL ranking, and you can share it to those groups. So that way, let's say you have another analyst who has another map. They're not going to add that same data set using the URL. They're going to go to that group and add that data set from that group. It's just so much more organized to do it that way. So I'm going to paste that URL in here, and ArcGIS Online does a great job of going ahead and filling out some information. We're going to put a title. So using that naming convention, we're going to say ORL4 hyphen stream gauges. You could also say observed stream gauges or forecast. I'm just going to say stream gauges, colon NOAA. Very simple. And then the next step, we're going to actually tag this item with the ranking and the use case. This is going to make it easier within your organization to search for content. So we've already got gauges, rivers, and stages in here. Stages I'm going to remove. I'm going to remove gauges too. That's kind of not super useful. Rivers is fine. We're definitely going to add flooding. That would be our use case, right? I'm also going to add planning. This is something that we do. I try to tag the incident command sector that would most likely be dealing with this data. In this case, it would be situational awareness, which rolls up through planning. And then finally, we're going to tag the ORL ranking, which is ORL4. Okay, now we're going to add the item. And the item is going to first show up in your content. So not anybody else is going to be able to see it, right? Because it's just in your content. So the next step of our process is to actually share that to that group we created earlier. So I'm going to go back to my item. Here's my item. Got a nice preview. Here's our naming convention. And the nice thing is that it actually brings in the metadata from that URL REST endpoint. So it brings it right into portal. It's super convenient. And here down at the bottom, here's where you can access that URL if you wanted to go back to this page.
Hey, Carrie.
Yes.
I just wanted to say there was a question put into the box that said, can you remind me where Carrie is getting the metadata info from the NOAA site?
Yes. I answered that earlier, but just in case anyone missed it. So the metadata, when we say metadata, we kind of actually mean different things. So there's official metadata, which comes with these services, and you can actually click on this link to get it. When I'm saying metadata, I'm using it in a broader term, which just means information about the data. So basically wherever you can find information about the data set, which in this case is at this REST endpoint page, but it's also in this graphical web page, which not every service is going to have a graphical web page associated with it. In this case, it does. And so I take that into account when I'm answering those questions in the form. So when I say metadata, I'm kind of using it in a broader way than maybe the technical metadata definition. So just to clarify that, because I know those of you who are more on the technical side might be thinking, well, that's not really technically the metadata. I hope that answers the question. Okay, so our next step in our process, we want this layer to be accessible to others, and we also want to put it in that group that we created. So I'm going to click share. And I want to share it to that ORL ranked data. So by doing this, I'm actually then making that data set available to anybody in that group. And there it is. So you can imagine once you start filling out these groups with all of your ranked data, you know, you can actually, if you have decision makers in your ArcGIS Online organization or in your portal, you can send them to these groups and they can look through this data on their own as well. It's pretty user friendly. You know, I can just click on open in map viewer and I can just look at the data. I don't even have to put it in a web app or anything like that. So there's definitely benefits to using these groups. And the other thing I'll mention, I don't want to get off on a tangent here, but if you're using enterprise sites for ArcGIS or Hub or something like that, you also have the ability to show these data sets within groups as a gallery within those different content management apps. So that's super useful as well. So if you were to do that, it would look like on your page, it would look like a gallery and you could kind of browse through the different data sets. So again, I definitely recommend, you know, using these groups.
Hey, Carrie.
Yes.
I'm going to ask, I'm going to see, I'm going to let people talk if they want to. I think this would be a good, we got about 15 minutes left. It'd be good if we can promote everybody, our panelists, and let them talk or share or ask questions while you go ahead. Make it a little more interactive.
Absolutely. And while we do that, I'm just going to go to this last step, which is we're going to add that data set to our web app. So as you guys remember, if I scroll down here, this is our web app, right? I'm going to expand it. So to add the data, I'm going to open the web map that's associated with that application. So with ArcGIS Online and Portal, there's always a web map that feeds the web app. And I've opened up the web map, which is where I can add that layer. So I just go to add, and I'm going to do search for layers. Here's where you would add layer from web, what I mentioned earlier. You could just paste that URL right in there, but again, I don't recommend doing that. We've added it as a portal item or an item in ArcGIS Online. And it actually shows me my most recent one. So this is it. I'm going to click add, and now it's in our web map. Click save. And if we go back to our content, you can see it brought in that ORL ranking right in there. I didn't have to put it in again. Once you put it in as the name of your layer within ArcGIS Online, it's going to go with that layer everywhere. So if another analyst adds that layer somewhere else, it's going to say ORL 4. Okay. So going back to this guy. Okay, here's our web app, and we've got our layer in there with the ranking. And I'm going to pop over to the chat. Is it going to let me? Yeah, Tom, if you wouldn't mind just reading off if there's any questions in the chat or speak up. I think we're making everybody panelists now.
Yeah, everybody's a panelist, so you can unmute your mics if you'd like, or turn on your video camera if you'd like. Carrie, I guess one of the first things is, can we talk to maybe some of the use cases where you see this, right? We spent a lot of time on when the work group got started, we were sharing data, but yet decision makers had no clue of, is this reliable or not? I think Dave Vanderbloemen mentioned to me that they spend half their time double validating the data, right? Right? I think you maybe you and Dave can speak to that. The tool helps us determine it, but the reason to determine it is it can have big ramifications. So maybe just take a minute and just kind of provide the perspective. Why did we even go to this, right?
Tom, I'll give you my perspective on it. If I'm sitting in an operating center, and I'm the operating person, I'm not the technical person. So I've got this data that I'm looking at, and without this 1, 2, 3, 4 ranking, I either have to guess or I have to make an assumption on how accurate or how reliable the data I'm looking at is. You can make an assumption, you can get lucky, and you may be a hero. But that rarely happens, at least not to me. So you've got these GIS professionals who understand this stuff to a T. I mean, Carrie probably can talk about this stuff in her sleep and you just know the questions to ask. Without this ranking, you don't even know where to begin. So I see a 1, I don't have to ask a lot of questions. I see a 2, I go to the GIS professional and say, this is a 2. Can you explain to me why it's a 2? Well, Dave, it's not being refreshed that often. You can see that it's being refreshed occasionally. I don't know the accuracy of it, but I don't know that. So now as a decision maker, I know why it's a 2. I can make those decisions. Now that I'm talking to the GIS person, I can think of more questions to ask them, and they start to understand what my needs are. I start understanding what they can provide me, and together we collaborate and build better and more accurate and more information that they know it's a hurricane coming. This is the stuff that Dave's going to need. Here's the accuracy of it. There it is. A new data set pops up. I've never seen it before. It's a 1. I don't have to ask anybody about it. I can trust because I'm building that internal relationship. Same way we're trying to build those external relationships. If you don't have that trust built internally, you're not going to build it externally, right? That's my perspective on it.
Right.
Yeah, and to build off of what Dave said, what I really started picking up on a couple years ago when we started this process, like Dave mentioned, is just this, I don't want to say breakdown, but sometimes it is a breakdown in communication between operations and GIS. And it's not anyone's fault, right? It's not GIS's fault. It's not operations.
Yeah, no, it's kind of like the doctor, the surgeon, and the anesthesiologist,
exactly.
Right?
In many cases, we speak different languages and the needs are different, right? So I see situations coming up where someone in operations, this usually happens in the middle of a storm event, right? Like an Irma, where someone is saying, hey, I need this data ASAP, and they're desperate, right? They need this information as quickly as possible. And as a GIS analyst, you feel that pressure and you want to get them something quickly. And, everybody's just going to worry about the data later, like whether or not it's refreshing, whether or not, we're just going to worry about that later. Let's get the data now. And I think what this is trying to do is put a stopgap in that and saying, hey, hold on, before we send that data over, we need to make sure we can ensure the reliability of the data. Because at the end of the day, and I talked about this yesterday a little bit, from the GIS perspective, if I give someone who's a decision maker, if I give them data that they use to make decisions and something bad happens because the data was not refreshing or it was wrong or something, that's going to come back on me. And I don't want that to happen. But also I don't want those things to happen in the first place. So it's really just trying to create that connection, that translation between these two groups that often work together. But a lot of times we work together more closely during events. So just speaking from my experience, and Tom, you mentioned use cases, right? So I wanted to kind of address that really quickly. When we talk about use cases, we often identify what situations tend to come up that require these types of data. Flooding would be an example use case, or routing would be an example use case. Base camp logistics would be one. So we try to kind of organize these data sets into what use case do they tend to help with. So, you know, this one would be flooding or situational awareness. A routing data set or data set that shows traffic would be more applicable to logistics or routing. So we can kind of organize our data in such a way. And you saw a little bit of that within ArcGIS Online when I was tagging use cases. We didn't really get into use cases a whole lot during this demo. But again, we're doing a longer workshop on March 4th. And I'd really like for us to dive deeper into use cases during that workshop, because use cases and ORLs tie very closely together.
So Carrie, I'm going to share my screen, and maybe you and Dave can comment on the graphic here. Why is ORL important? Because in the use cases developed within the sites, you have multiple layers of varying types of data. Let me zoom in for a second. And if one is a 4 and the other ones are a 2, you know what you see what I'm saying? I was trying to get to the point, Carrie, we talk about, we've got to know the ranking of each of these layers. Maybe you guys want to talk to this for a minute, because it isn't just one data set and that solves all the world's problems for a use case, right? It's state, it's commercial, it's truck drivers, it's, you know, relationships with aerial people. I mean, one use case could have 5 layers of data. Maybe you want to talk about this for a minute as it relates to the ORL of each layer.
Well, to me, Tom, and Carrie mentioned this earlier, is that the relationship between the GIS technician and the operational decision makers, if I'm only tracking Carrie down during an event, then I'm not knowing what to ask for. She's not understanding what I need, and the chances of being successful are probably going to be slim. So hopefully what this exercise has done is provided the GIS people an understanding of how you can take available data, because you all know what data is out there. And now that you know, you have the ability to give it a ranking, you can present it to the operational people in a way they can understand it. So they ask you the right questions. Now, hopefully you're asking these questions during planning sessions, during tabletops, during organizational update meetings when you're talking to each other, and not during the event. So during the event, you already have all these cool data sets that Carrie and your GIS people are putting in. You just click on the ones that you need to see for that use case. You see the data that you need, you make your decision, and you can trust that you made it with the best information available. Without this, we're just going to be chasing our tails, and we're going to be basically hoping that we make the right decision based on luck. And luck usually doesn't follow you around very often.
Carrie?
I echo what Dave said. I just want to reiterate that this is more than just a model, a data model. Really, this is an effort to really bridge communication gaps and bring together people in operations and GIS. I really can't stress that enough. It's about community building, which is partially why this hasn't just rolled out and become a standard right away. We're really trying to build that community, and the use cases help, right? So as a GIS professional, if I understand, these are the kinds of questions that get asked if we're in a flooding situation. Okay, I understand the data that's needed. I understand, you know, how to better help that person who's the decision maker. So the use cases are really like an organizing structure around these conversations, if that makes sense. It helps me understand what is needed, what questions are being asked. If I understand that, I can better provide data and resources.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. Well, as you look at the screen, we're in the midst of this damage assessment right now. And so far, we will have live state data, and we'll talk about this in the SICENet briefing at 3 o'clock. We'll have state data, 2 different sources from state, Dominion. We hope to get flooding, transportation, aerial photographs, social media, so that, as Alan Bradshaw from Dominion has said, if we can make this happen, and all these layers are rated with an ORL standard, they can make assessments quicker, which means they can they can improve their ETA, their ETRs, right? Estimated time of restoration, but you can't do that until you have better handle on what's broken, right? But it can't just be one data. It's got to be a number of layers. And so if you don't know what the ORL ranking are for data, for the layers of data in that use case, you really don't know how reliable that is, right? Carrie, we had a question is, could you talk about use cases with city, county, or state EOCs? Okay, so we just teed one up there for damage assessment. Maybe for street, road, highway damage assessment and debris removal progress. Are there GIS data sets for those parts of the overall restoration process? Great question, John.
So is the question whether or not there's GIS data sets available for these use cases?
Are there GIS data sets for those parts of the overall restoration process?
Yes. That's the question. Yes.
John,
Anybody
elaborate.
doing that?
Elaborate for just a minute.
Well, it just strikes me that every power company, when the wind gets down below 40 and they've got to send out their damage assessment crews, they need to know how far down a street they can go before they have to get out of their SUV and start walking. And
Right.
I mean, years ago, I don't know what the current state of it is, but at CenterPoint Energy after Ike in 2008, they had 1,600 square miles of damage. I mean, that's enormous. And they sent out 400 people, each of them with a 4 square mile grid with all of their assets printed out on the 4 square mile grid on paper. And so, a supervisor in an SUV or some vehicle, truck, whatever, would go as far as they could and then have to walk another 2 miles, 3 miles, 4 miles.
Wow.
Just to get to the damage area.
So I know we've been talking with Virginia, Stacy Neal, and they have got data from their own drones, private drones, it's state by state though, right? This isn't ubiquitous across the country.
Sure.
And the Civil Air Patrol. And so you'll see, I think, which panel are we going to go into this with? One of the panels this afternoon talks a little bit about, but yeah, the answer is yes. The aerial data, and Dave, correct me wrong, but I think utilities run their own aerial data as well. We don't have that data set yet, but they're trying to look at drone snapshots of infrastructure damage, and maybe there's a way to use that as well to get an overall aerial picture to answer John's question.
They're capturing drone data, but the challenge is transmitting that data from the drone back to the central office, since it's really large data sets and it's hard to get there. So really it's being used with damage assessors in the field that are translating that damage assessment into the outage management system. But electronic damage assessment, as you mentioned, I know Dominion's been doing it for 15 years. We've had electronic damage assessment. A lot of companies were using paper maps, but that's quickly going to the wayside and being done. I think you'll see by the SciSnet the ability to take the damage assessment that the utilities doing, the damage assessment that the public utility groups are doing, put them together on one platform and share it. Now I see it as being ultimately, rather than everybody going and collecting their own independent data, maybe one day one person can collect the data for everybody in a location, so you can leverage those people in multiple areas. So I don't have to send a road clearing crew, a utility crew, and a telecom crew all to the same area to collect that damage assessment. Maybe one person can collect it all and share it graphically on an Esri or a GeoCloud platform.
An ultimate force multiplier.
Yeah. Well, and we're in the early stages, John. The part that was missing was governance and control of, so the data provider could say, I want to know who's looking at this data, for what purpose, for how long. That's what the SICE does. It's not a, it's a governance structure, right? And now it's state by, the drill, it's state by state. And that's kind of why we're going to form a work group around it. All of you on this session will get an invite to the workshop, an invite to participate in the GIS. We have our GIS committee calls every Friday at 10 a.m. So we get into these use case discussions often. SICEnet, which is going to talk about at 3 o'clock. SICEnet is the initiative that's going to hopefully start bringing that together. We're starting with Virginia and Dominion, but we've had interest from Alabama, Pennsylvania, other states, as well as the other utilities are going to watch, see how Dominion's benefiting from that. But I think in the long run, it'll be a wonderful thing to help everybody. So we're up against our time right now. We're going to go to break. Carrie, Dave, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
If you're going to
Thank you,
stay
Carrie.
on, if you're going to stay on track 3, don't do a thing. But at our next session starts at 2:25. If you want to change tracks, you can go to ahc2021.com. All 3 tracks, you just click on the ones you want. You make sure you just leave this one before you go there. Okay. So enjoy the break, and we'll see you on the flip side.
Thank you much.
Thank you,
Okay.
Tom.
Thanks, everybody.